Welcome to Missionize with the Missions Guys, a podcast of the Arkansas Baptist State Convention, offering biblical and practical insight and strategies designed to equip and encourage missions leaders to carry on mission work. The goal is to fulfill the Great Commission from a church's local community to the ends of the earth. That is why we missionize. Now here are your hosts, the Missions Guys, Sam Roberts and Clint Ritchie.
Welcome to Missionize. Appreciate you joining us today, wherever you're listening, whatever time of the day. We're glad that you are our guests. Dr. Sam, we have made it to episode number 10.
How about that, Clint?
So I'm 10. 10. We're in double digits.
That's 5 months worth, right?
I think so, yes.
It's twice a month that these drop. Now, I feel good about that until I read something by Mark Clifton, you know, our buddy Mark with NAM, who, when they do their podcasts, they will record 10 to 20 at a time.
At a time, yes.
At a time, okay? Yeah. But we're celebrating today.
We are.
10 is a big number.
And we got past number 9. You were gone. We had to pull in Vince, and we didn't get canceled. But you came back from the Dominican Republic. Yeah,
Just wait.
Well, you came back from the Dominican Republic, been in Brazil. Before that, a couple international trips. Before we jump in on today's topic, tell us what you've been up to on those trips.
Yeah, this has been awesome, Clint. We have had 2 trips the last couple of months where we have taken a group of Arkansas Baptist pastors to really pour in to some pastors in those areas. In Brazil, we had 30 to 35 pastors that gathered for a 3 to 4 day conference, a pastors' conference. At the same time, while they were meeting, 4 of the guys, their wives came with them. And so they did a women's conference, and they had 35 to 40 ladies that showed up and just had an incredible time there in Açu, Brazil. We also got to tour several of the ministry sites where the planters were planting a church. Got to go into a local school, an invitation from the school to that pastor. Awesome. For us to come back that afternoon after we had prayer walk the community that morning and did door-to-door evangelism. So that was incredible, getting to talk to different groups of elementary kids. In those 4 different communities we visited, I think there were some 80 homes. We went door-to-door sharing the gospel, saw over 40 people come to faith in Christ. It was just an incredible 10 days we spent there. And then just recently came back from the Dominican Republic, where we did basically the same thing. Poured into 31 pastors there, had 4 other pastors, an associational missionary, as well as Steve, a new member of our team that came. And then we got to tour some of those sites. The whole purpose of these 2 trips is to help connect our Arkansas Baptist pastors with mission opportunities in other areas. So listeners, hey, be praying for that. A lot of excitement building. And if you have an interest in joining us in one of these trips in this next year, give me a call, give Steve a call, let us know.
All right. Well, I saw your pictures, especially from the Dominican. Some beautiful scenery, except when I saw the shorts you guys were wearing. Those some legs that needed sunlight.
Come on, Clint. We're going to pull out the mug again and talk about your big head here in a few minutes.
Well, we can do that.
Come on.
I'll tell you, the warm weather and the long days are a welcome addition after some winter months. But the double-edged sword that can be is for pastors and church leaders, these things can affect church attendance. This is the time of year families are beginning to plan vacations, or they've planned them now. They're going on vacations. Weekend trips to the lake will soon become norm. Lots of family playing travel ball sports. All these things can keep families, and do keep families, from attending their church, but it's not seasonal. Travel sports are year-round. Hunting seasons come in and go. Holidays create the same tension. So, Dr. Sam, as a pastor, how frustrating was it for you to see these attendance fluctuations from week to week?
Boy, I tell you what, this is one of those areas, and we've talked about this before a little bit, Clint, when we talked about leveraging the calendar and talked about those rhythms of life, you know, that we have to know within the community as well as within the church. early on in my ministry, this was frustrating. Boy, it was. It was so frustrating because I knew exactly. I've always been in, since I've been back to Arkansas, in rural areas, agricultural areas. And so during those seasons, that attendance is going to fluctuate. The farmers are gone. Going to be preaching in one of our Delta churches pretty soon, and already had that conversation with the pastor to say, it's that time of the year, so a lot of our guys are not going to be there. So it is frustrating to a certain extent, but I think over the years, as I matured a little bit in ministry, I began to look at it through a different lens, and that is my responsibility as a pastor of discipling the families in the church, individuals in the church, to live missionally wherever they are, whatever that means. And of course, in Stuttgart, man, we had the sports, we had the hunting, we had the agriculture stuff. We had a lot of professional people that were 10 years from retirement, those sort of things. They've done pretty good financially, and there's that RV that they purchased. There's that lake house that they've purchased, and then they've got to justify those purchases. And what does that mean? They work through the week, so they're going to be gone a whole lot. But I started to look at it a little differently, and how can I, as a pastor, encourage, how can I disciple, how can I equip them to be on mission wherever they are?
Well, that's what we're going to jump into today, and it can be a pretty tough subject. And so we brought in an expert. And joining us today is Brandon Moore. Brandon is the BCM Campus Minister at UCA, and soon will begin a role as the Dean of Spiritual Development at Shiloh Christian School in Springdale. Brandon, welcome, first of all, to Missionize today.
Thank you, man. I'm so honored to be here. I am not an expert. I'm just someone with some experience, but I'm honored to be here. I can't wait.
Well, we want to hear from you. That you had a unique experience, and what led to us asking you to join this conversation with us. You wrote a couple of blogs, or 3 of them recently, about the travel ball dilemma. From your perspective as a former travel ball player, a collegiate baseball player, a professional baseball player, and then as a minister. And so I want us to start by putting the disclaimer that this podcast is not to beat up on travel ball participants.
Right.
That's right.
That may be where we focus our conversation on, but there are other things that we've mentioned already that already compete with church attendance. I come to this discussion from a unique perspective as well, as a travel ball parent, a former travel ball coach, as a minister, and we may all come to different conclusions here. But like Dr. Sam said, the tension for me was not as much about attending church as it was about being missional as a family. And so I want us to come back to that topic as we weave throughout this today. But Brandon, you looked at this from 2 different angles: what parents can do and what the church can do. Mm-hmm. And I want to encourage folks to read those articles. But what stood out to me was how you focused on the parent's role. And as I looked at that, I saw Deuteronomy 6 in action. That we, as we talk about this podcast, is to be biblical. We want to be biblical. Deuteronomy 6, we're to impress these things upon our children, to teach them as we're going along the road, as we're sitting at home. You talked about having this conversation with the children, and then the parents leading in spiritual content. Let's jump into that. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think, looking through that, after I wrote the article, because I was just kind of brain dumping to some degree the things that I think could be helpful for travel ball parents. After I wrote it, I was like, man, that's just kind of what it looks like to lead your family spiritually. And so I think that what you're saying, Deuteronomy 6, that's the priority for each and every family, to be honest with your children about, the things that you're uncertain about. That's the main thing I wrote about. Because I came from a perspective of like, okay, I don't want to trash any family doing this, because the social pressures here are just unreal. I think in the articles I related it to having an iPhone, right? Like that's almost like everybody has an iPhone these days, even though we know that iPhones and the access you have to the internet are potentially really damaging for children. But we just do it kind of unquestioned and without question. But when it comes to travel ball, oftentimes we throw shade at people for doing it. Really, there's the same kind of tension. It's just social pressures. And so I wanted to show a lot of grace to the travel ball families that are kind of in the weeds right now. They wake up each day thinking, am I making the right decision? And so, with Deuteronomy 6 and just that whole thought process of impressing the Word of God and the spiritual rhythms on your family's heart and mind, I think it's obviously important for every family to do that. But when it comes to the travel ball families, it's almost we can't not do it. You know what I'm saying? Like in some families, you can get away with not doing because you've got church and you've got the rhythms, you've got all this stuff. But with the travel ball folks, like once you take church out, that rhythm, that weekly rhythm, you've got to be doing it. It's just crucial.
Yeah, Brendan, I applaud you for those 5 practices that you shared in that article. That's gold, man. That I just want to take just a moment and kind of walk through these and share these with the listeners in case they haven't read the article. The first was this: let your kids in on how you are processing this decision. Yeah. Man, that is incredible. Talk just a little bit more about that. You mentioned it, but dig into that just a little bit.
Yeah, well, if your kids see you with, I think the phrase I used was unchallenged priority. If sports become the unchallenged priority, well, then no wonder they're going to think that sports are king, And I really think, as I was considering it, there's a lot of statistics around, high school kids dropping out of the church basically once they get to college. And then you take something like travel ball, you're like, well, of course they're going to drop out because they're off doing travel ball and stuff. But maybe it's the travel ball thing, but maybe it's the family has unchallenged priorities and church isn't in that. It's the hunting, it's the fishing, it's the travel ball. It's, it could be any number of things that when church tries to challenge that thing, then church always loses. If that's happening, it's a problem. And so letting your kids in, you may be feeling the tension, but if you don't tell your kids, they don't know that. Like they have no idea that you are sad and frustrated and confused and unsure, and you're really wrestling with God if that's what you should be doing or should not be doing, And so letting them in on that process, one, it shows kids like, oh, there's wisdom that we need here, which is a valuable thing. 2, we can't make decisions lightly. That's a valuable thing. 3, God is important and needs to be considered in every aspect of our life. All that's important. And so letting them in on that, I think, is one of those musts. Obviously, it's number 1 there.
Yeah,
so I thought it was important.
That was awesome. And that is across the board. That's incredible parental advice for any mom and dad that want to follow Jesus. There are decisions that we make all the time as parents that are difficult decisions.
Hard ones.
And I love the emphasis on bringing the kids into that to let them know, hey, here's the struggle.
Yeah, and there's obviously stuff that you keep from your kids. You can't let everything. Yeah. But just some of those, the things they need to know that you're in some sense just in your prayer closet really wrestling with this. It shows all kinds of dependence on God and need for wisdom. And so, I think it's crucial in every aspect, but especially this one that has such potential consequences.
Yeah. And then just let me briefly state these other 4 practices. Number 2, prioritize worship in another way. You talked about making a playlist of songs and having that worship time together. Prioritize family Bible reading. Actually prioritize mission. We're going to jump into that in just a few moments. And then do your research ahead of time and find a local church in the city you're playing in. That's gold, man. And as I read through that, I was thinking as a pastor that, the pastor can play a huge role in discipling and equipping parents to help them in the decision-making processes, but also to show grace. When decisions are made that a pastor may say, that's not the decision I would have made. But that's great stuff.
Well, can I add something to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thing? So, I've been interim at a local church for around 6 months now, preach weekly at BCM. And the thing that I've found in my own heart is when people don't show up or they leave for a few weeks at a time, you know, there's something in your heart, and I don't know if y'all have experienced this. I certainly did. But there's something in your heart that almost just, it's deep down in there that thinks, is my preaching not good enough to keep them here? Am I not good enough pastor? Not good enough leader? There's a certain sense of insecurity that comes from a question like that. Like, is my preaching not good enough to keep them here? And so if we don't work through our insecurities, you know, talking about as you mature in ministry, if we don't work through our insecurities, then every time we think about the travel ball family, we're going to think about our own insecurity and shame. And if we don't ever get past that, we're not ever going to help them. Like, it's impossible to help people if every time we see them, we think about our own shame because we're not a good enough leader to keep them there. And
Dude,
so,
as I was reading through your articles again last night, I had the same thought.
Yeah.
I had the exact same thought. I didn't write it down in my notes.
That's okay.
But I was like, okay, how much our response as a pastor to, and we're talking specifically travel ball, but we could be talking about anything, the priority of worship on Sunday, and how much of our reaction is insecurity on our own part.
I would say a lot of it, unfortunately. It really is. We're just insecure, and it's easier to get mad at people than it is to deal with our own insecurities. And so once we deal with our insecurities, that's when we can actually move forward into discipling them, teaching them how to live on mission, all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Good stuff.
Well, and let me say, I don't know that is. I think, yes, there's that insecurity, but I think there's also a sense of, can be pride on a pastor's perspective of believing, in a sense, that the only way that a person can grow spiritually is to hear from me, you know? So, I mean, I know, I probably can speak for Dr. Sam, for myself as a pastor, I mean, I beat up folks because you're supposed to be here, you're supposed to be here. And there were some things in this journey, you know, my kids got in travel ball when I was still a pastor, that as we, worked through this, there were some convictions that I had, and one of those being that so much of our spiritual life becomes dependent upon whoever's on the stage or on the platform. Yeah. And, so rather than teaching our folks that this is how you walk with the Lord personally, this is how you interact with the Lord, seeking the Lord on a daily basis, that your relationship is personal, that we think, and we can get in that rhythm. If you want to hear from the Lord, you got to be here. And again, I should have put this caveat out earlier that we don't want to minimize the church.
No,
exactly. That the three of us have given our life to serving the Lord through the local church. Mm-hmm. And so we don't want to minimize the church at all. Mm-hmm. But I do, I think it's important for us to remember the responsibility that we have as parents to disciple our children. It's not the church's responsibility. It's the parents' responsibility. And I was talking to a pastor recently. His kid is starting travel ball, and he said, I look, and I have become real legalistic in my church attendance. Mm. And he said that not as much of desiring to go because it's my chance to worship, but going because I'm supposed to. Yeah. And so I think we can get in that rhythm as well. But I will also say that, I think all of us as church leaders have to be very intentional about being around lost people. Yeah. We spend our time, Dr. Sam and I, around pastors and church leaders. You're on college campus around more lost students than we are. So, but I have to be very intentional to be around lost people because I can insulate myself and isolate myself and just be around Christians all the time. And the way that me and my family do that is through travel ball. Mm-hmm. It's being around softball reminds me I'm around lost people, regularly.
And I think I may have wrote it in the articles, certainly one of them. And to your point about minimizing local church, after I wrote the first one, my wife read it. She's like, "You better make sure that you say something about going to church." And I did.
It's Article 3.
Yeah, Article 3. My personal opinions. I basically tell everybody like, "Hey, go to church," because I played professional baseball and I made it to low A, which is like in the top 0.1% of all people who play baseball. And I was out of the league. I was out of minor league baseball in 3 years, And at 24, I had to figure out who I was and all that stuff. And so, yeah, it's just so unrealistic for people to make it to the big leagues. That's just one small portion. I think, man, you got to go to church and be in church.
Hey, part of that maturity process I was talking about earlier with me, you know, we are just as men, okay. We base things on numbers. Yeah. We are competitors, and so that attendance becomes one of those metrics that we evaluate the effectiveness of the church. Part of that maturity process for me was saying maybe there's a different scorecard. You know, that the effectiveness of the church is not so much in the number of people who gather on Sunday, but in the number of people that are sent and are actually living the gospel out throughout the week. And so that is the emphasis that I loved in your writing of these articles, because it's all over that. You know, here's the responsibility. Yes, parents, you have a responsibility. You make that decision. That's a family decision. It's a mom and dad decision here. But as pastors, then we come alongside of those parents to equip them, to train them, to encourage them that this is a vital part of your life right now in this phase of life. How can you use this to leverage for the gospel, you know, and being missional?
Yeah, and that certainly starts, I think, in like the off season. If we're talking about travel ball, like, you know, there's going to be Sundays where if you know the calendar, if you know, okay, here's when they'll all leave, then you also know when they'll all be there. And so including things in your sermon illustrations, you know, pointing them, giving them a different vision for what that time looks like, you know, throwing out illustrations like, hey, what if you were able to lead 3-4 people to Christ off of your team? Like giving them a vision for that possibility. And, you know, because if we're constantly frustrated, constantly making kind of backhanded statements about them not being there, well, then all they're going to think about when they're there is how they feel bad for not being at church. When in reality, there's, you know, 10 lost people sitting around them that have never heard the gospel. Growing up in baseball, I realized, especially once I got to college, I came to faith in college, but once I started to see things and understand things, even the most spiritually mature people in baseball, families, kids, all of it, they are like an inch deep spiritually, like, because they just never go to church. And so, like, having the opportunity to actually sit down and have conversations with families about the gospel, about the faith, about Jesus Christ, we don't want to miss that opportunity. And so I think really, like you're saying, equipping them, giving families a different vision for what that time could look like is incredibly important.
There's one other thing along those lines that I just thought about. You know, during COVID, when we wrote quite a bit of content for our churches and how to be missional during this time, especially as a family, and we talked about one of the points was to commission your families to go out as missionaries in the service. That may be something
what if every February we got the families together and say, hey, these families are going to be in and out for the next few months, but they will be around more lost people than most of us will be all year. You know, like in one weekend, a family that's at the ballpark is probably around more lost people than most of the families in the church all year in one weekend. And so really leaning into that. And you can't just wake up. You know, I've been reading a lot in the Proverbs about the sluggard who, you know, wakes up at harvest time and there's nothing to harvest because they didn't do the work earlier in the season. You know, if you're waiting until you know, March, but all right, let's put together a gospel training for these families, you're probably gonna miss because and it's gonna be discouraging. But what if in November you said, hey, this time's coming, let's take the next 2 months, 2-3 months to train on gospel, practice, lean into that. That way in March you're ready to actually share the gospel with these families, and then you commission them as if they're missionaries. You know, I think the illustration I used in one of the, I read it before I came in here as well, is I think I said, what do you call a Christian who used to go to church, who doesn't really anymore, watches online when they can, is not around a lot of Christians? Well, depending on how you see that person, they're either a missionary overseas with bad internet connection or they're a travel ball family. And so commissioning them the same way, I think, could be invaluable, not only to the church to pray for that family, but for that family to see themselves as that, instead of seeing themselves as someone who's, being a poor church member, but to see themselves as a missionary. Those are two very different things, and it's going to affect how they behave, I guess, when they're out there.
Yeah, good stuff.
And that's what I think. When you're sending somebody out, there's also a level of accountability in there.
Oh, yeah. And
so I think you go in that February time and you commission these families out. Most of them, especially they're obviously kids, students, they're going to be in churches that have a very active student ministry on Wednesday night.
Yep.
And so that may become their regular pattern. Hey, we're not in Sunday morning service, but we're going to be in service on Wednesday night. Mm-hmm. Why can't you then bring those students up in front of their peers and say, Johnny wasn't here Sunday, he was playing ball, but we commissioned you. Tell us, who did you have a gospel conversation with this weekend?
Yeah.
Or tell us, what's been happening in the last month in your season. However, just to give some accountability and to show that faith happens outside the walls of the church, that as we're living missionally, as we're about the work of the ministry or work of missionize, that, we are in showing that we're sending, but we're also holding that accountability. You mentioned, let's go back to that, the training. As a pastor, pastor may be listening. Okay, what advice would you give him on how to start that conversation with families, and then what kind of training would you give them?
Yeah, so I think as far as you're talking about for a family at the ballpark, how they can start a conversation with non-believers. I think it first and foremost, what I walk our college students through, and I think it can be somewhat similar, is you just start with general conversation. You obviously just get to know somebody. Typically, if you're on the same team, you know them fairly well. But so you start with this general conversation, then you go below the surface conversation. You go surface level, then below the surface. So that's where, if on a surface level, that someone's family, they've got a relative that's in the hospital. Below the surface would be say, hey, tell me how you're handling that. How are you navigating that? How's the family doing with that person being in the hospital? And so you're getting below the surface with those people. And so as you get below the surface, you start to get more comfortable with them. Then you start asking general spiritual questions or surface level spiritual questions. Hey, have you ever gone to church? Or what's your church history like? Some things that are more general across the face. What do you think about church? Things like that. And as you get more comfortable there, you start asking specific spiritual questions like, well, what about your faith? What about your background? Have you ever, read the Bible consistently? Things like that. And you're almost working them down this path of you're helping people get comfortable with one another, and you're inviting them into deeper conversation. And so that's how I would train people, honestly, is you got to be good at conversation and listening to people. And inviting them into deeper stuff. And so that typically when I train evangelism, it's all about like, how are we having good conversations with people and listening to them so that we can ask the proper spiritual questions for that. And that's the type of stuff that can be implemented anywhere. You go to a gas station, you see somebody really struggling, you can ask some general spiritual questions from that.
I think a lot of that is just opening our eyes and seeing the needs that exist all around us.
It is. And I think that, if you're talking about like holding folks accountable. If the primary theme, I guess you will, around this conversation in the church is one of shame and embarrassment, the pastor feels embarrassed that people aren't there. The people are embarrassed because they feel like they're letting the pastor down or the church down. You're never going to get to that accountability piece. And so, starting with these, it's almost like calling everybody together and saying, "Hey, let's just talk about the elephant in the room. Y'all aren't going to be here. Everybody else wants you to be here. We need to really address this." And the pastor letting them know, like, "Hey, I am not mad at you. We're going to send you out faithfully, and then start your training from there." Because if the general theme is embarrassment, it's just never going to happen.
Yeah. One other step that you mentioned in one of the articles, I can't remember if it's 2 or 3, but I think it was the second article. Another way that pastors would support it is through when there are those gospel conversations, when that player or that parent has led someone to Christ, celebrate that in front of the church and let them know.
And that's the piece of accountability and sending them out as missionaries. Celebrate. You hear people say it. what you celebrate will be replicated, or some variation of that. If you're up there every Sunday celebrating that someone came to faith, that one in general, that's nice. That would be awesome. And I understand some of us are in contexts where like that's just not happening, and that's okay. But yeah, if you're training missionaries, you're sending them out, somebody comes to faith, you celebrate that, the whole church starts to get around it. Just imagine if you put together this scene, kind of what we talked about. You've got 4 families that will be gone all spring and summer because of travel ball. You commission them out. The church prays for them. The church commits to pray for them every Thursday, I think is what I suggested in there, because that's right before the weekend. And then over the course of the spring and summer, those 4 families see 10 people come to faith in Christ. That is incredible, right? Like that is so awesome. And that's the type of thing that just sparks a sense of revival in a church community. Whereas if we take the opposite approach and we just get frustrated with them, you never see it. And so, yes, it's disappointing they're not in church. Yes, we want them in church. I would be willing to bet at least 75% of those families also want to be in church. They just don't know what to do with the situation at hand. And so, yeah, really leaning into that, celebrating those things would be important. Or even celebrating just conversations. Yeah. Like, celebrating when a mom or a dad texts a pastor and say, "Hey, I'm having a conversation with John about the gospel. They didn't come to faith." Talk about that on Sunday. Like, "Hey, so-and-so had a conversation with a guy named John. He's super close to share the gospel." And you just celebrate those things. It really does something in the congregation, I think, or it can.
I agree. And that's why, again, I think just having that perspective that's beyond the walls of the church, yep, and seeing that as your people are living missionally, yep, the impact is far. Yep. And so just if I can take the privilege just to share, the journey that my family went on with that. So when I was pastoring, my wife and I were both coaching teams one summer, all-star team, so everybody was from town. Yeah. And I took a vacation on a Sunday because we were going to be playing in a big tournament. And we had committed that, hey, we were going to do a devotional that morning in our hotel room. And the providence of God, we ended up in a handicap hotel room, which is much larger. Yeah. And long story short, that Sunday morning, over 60 parents, grandparents, and kids piled into our Sunday school room, our hotel room, and we transformed it to a Sunday school room. But I looked in that room that day, and there were families there that I had invited to First Baptist Church that never came. Yep. But I also looked out, and there were families that I baptized, the parents and the kids, because of a relationship that started, yep, with softball. And then, of course, now being in this role, it's a little different. But when days when my kids are playing, somebody's particularly right now, my youngest one, for a year now, she has led devotionals for her teams, mm-hmm, before the game, as a 13, 14-year-old who took the initiative to ask her coach if she could do that. And I see her pouring into the Word and doing a devotional from scratch, and have seen her get other teammates now to participate in that. There's nowhere that she can go that I have found on a Sunday morning and have that opportunity to serve and use her gift that way. Yep. So again, I have seen that. I've seen, like as today, she will lead the devotional at FCA at BB Junior High, mm-hmm, and does that pretty well every week. Nobody else does it. And so she's kind of in that routine of, I know how to do it, I'll do it. So, mm-hmm, I've seen discipleship, I guess all that to say, yeah, seen discipleship happen. And I think it could even be greater if there was that support from the church and from pastor, yeah, to say, hey, wow, that's awesome, you're doing that. Tell me what you're sharing this week. How can I pray for you? Who's on your team that we need to be praying for? And provide that kind of support. So I think it'd be changing. Let's again to wrap up. Let's go to your number 3. You come to the conclusion. Yeah. Go to church. So speak to that.
Yeah, like I said a little bit earlier, there's so many reasons why people would choose to do travel ball over going to church. One of them is sometimes people really do buy the lie that playing travel ball will get their kid into college and play professional baseball or whatever sport it is. And That's just not true. It's just really not. And so that is a lie that needs to be addressed. And I think the other, lie, or one of the other lies that needs to be addressed is like that this will be better for the kids socially and relationally and all that kind of stuff. I think that being in church community is valuable, but primarily the thing that I had the toughest time kicking in my own heart was I did not realize how far deep the idol of baseball went for me. And I talked about it in one of the posts, I think, and probably number 3 as well. But this is a theory of mine. Sometimes I have theories that it takes me a while to actually say them out loud because I don't know how true they are. But it's built into our rhythm to worship, right? We're made to worship. We're made to worship exactly. God. It's built into our rhythm to worship on Sunday mornings. And so I just examining my own life and other people's lives, I've grown convinced that what we do on Sunday mornings becomes what we worship. And that can be any number of things. And so imagine, 10 years of not being at church doing sports. Well, eventually your heart's going to worship that sport. And I saw that in my life. It took me another 10 years after being done to realize like how deep that idol actually went in my heart. And so we're created to worship God with the saints in corporate worship. And I think it's important as parents to lean in and say, okay, there's going to be a time where we live on mission through this avenue of sports. But this is a temporary thing, and we need to get back to church and prioritize it and figure out. That's all of what post number 1 is about, is like, how do we actually prioritize this in the midst of this thing that isn't favorable, but we're navigating it? Because the problem is much larger. The problem is we live in a society that doesn't know how to rest and is 24/7. Feels like you have to have, you have to be doing the thing every single day in order to be successful. But as parents, sitting back and saying, no, this is like, I'm not going to let society dominate how I raise my children. And what the Bible says is that we need to be in corporate worship. And so I think my opinion is you got to go to church. And understandably, there's going to be times and seasons where that's a little more difficult, but prioritizing it in some way is a must.
Yeah. Amen. Hey, that's a good way to wrap it up, right?
I believe so. Before we wrap up, though, let's tell folks where they can find these articles. BrandonMoore.substack.com.
Yes,
is that correct?
BrandonMoore.substack.com. They're on my Facebook as well. They're a few months back. But, yeah, BrandonMoore.substack.com. And I post weekly. I send out articles weekly. I've got some other thoughts about travel ball. I've got way too many thoughts about it. But I posted 3, one for the parents, one for the church, and then one of my own opinions on what to do.
Yeah, there's some great content there. I read through several of those blogs. Thank you for adding your voice. And we are grateful for those who have chosen to join us today and listen in. Yeah. One thing I can guarantee you, that on Mission Eyes, we're not going to back away from some of the difficult subjects that are out there. Because these are things that pastors deal with, and that this is how we not only stress the importance of being in church, going to church, but being the church. And so, hey, if you've got questions, if you've got comments, please let us know. Send an email to me or Clint at missioneyes@absc.org.
That's it.
Is that correct? Good. Look forward to hearing from you. Until next time, God bless. Have a great day.
Thanks for joining the Missions Guys today. If you liked what you heard, rate and review us on your favorite podcasting platform. And to keep up with what is happening in Arkansas Missions, visit absc.org/missions.